But thank you for being here this morning. I'm excited to continue and finish our series on women in Jesus this morning, as we've been looking over the last few weeks at the disciples of Jesus that traveled with him and learned from him that were women, and we learned about their lives and what we can learn and understand from their lives and interactions with Christ. And then last week we talked a little bit about those women who saw healing in God's presence, and the times that we can see from their examples of how we should respond to answered prayers, and then also how we should respond when those prayers are not answered in those moments, and when we have that gap between a promise made and a promise fulfilled by Jesus. And so I hope that you've been encouraged by that so far. And this morning I'm excited to continue and to talk more about these examples of women who were around to be witnesses and testimonies to Jesus' life today. So today we're going to talk about Jesus' life. And this is an interesting aspect of the message for me as I've done some research on it and gone through this week. Because the thing about this that strikes me is that God chose women of faith to be the first and most reliable witnesses to his life and his resurrection from the very beginning. And so I want you just to think for a minute. Before Jesus was ever born, who was the first person to know that he was going to be manifest, going to come as a human being on earth? It was Mary, wasn't it? Right? And she and her cousin Elizabeth probably had many long conversations as they were kind of pregnant together. I don't know how many of you have ever kind of had a friend or a family member who was pregnant at the same time as you were, and you got to share some of those experiences, but I can only imagine the conversations that they had. And this morning I want to look at just this first moment of the announcement of Jesus' life coming to be. And I want you just to think for just a minute about what this really meant. And I have to tell you that I cannot express what this meant. And guys, I'm sorry, we probably can't understand exactly what this meant. But ladies, many of you who have born children and been pregnant may understand at a much deeper level than I do and some of the rest of us in this room what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about carrying a child for 9 months, all the experiences that you have with that infant. But I want you to open your Bibles with me to Luke chapter 1, verse 26, and I want you to see with me the message that Mary receives, and I want us to talk for just a minute about the realities of what that message would mean for her. So it's not Christmas yet, but we're going to do a little Christmas moment here. Luke chapter 1 and verse 26. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. And the angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus. He'll be great, and he'll be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I'm a virgin?" And the angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." Now, yesterday we had kind of a good day at our house. Number one, go Dogs. It was still underwhelming, but that's okay. Go Dogs, that's right. Keisha fixed all sorts of delicious goodies and was just really kind, actually, to me yesterday to let me have, a wonderful buffalo cheese dip for my chips. And I'm a sucker for, the little smokies, the little spicy hot dogs you put in barbecue. So come on. We had to have them at our wedding, I think, if I remember right. That was not part of the caterer's suggestions. But I was like, well, we're going to have them at the wedding. And the caterer's like, "I thought you wanted a nice wedding." And I was like, "Cook them." Right? So it was like how it went a little bit, right? Our family we had our family pictures made with a professional photographer and all that stuff. We haven't done that since the girls were in middle school, probably. And so it's been a hot minute, a few years. And so we went out, we all got dressed up, matched, all that great stuff. And we did the whole thing where, you have everybody together and you throw the leaves in the air, you're walking and all that kind of stuff, and then you all pose together, and then it's just the daughters, right? I have 3 daughters, so it's all my girls together in the pictures, and then me and Keisha, and then different versions of that. But my favorite is always the one that they take when it's Keisha and the girls together, right? Where I'm not ruining it. I'm off the screen a little bit, so that's a good thing. And then I just love when Keisha and the girls are together in these photos and everything, because I just see like all my girls right there, and it's just really awesome and just incredible. But there's just a special connection between mothers and daughters. It's not always a fun connection. Those years in the middle there, but it gets better, and it's a special connection that they have that is not the same as the connection that I have. The mothers have a different connection with their kids than fathers do. They both have connections, but it's just different, And I think that as I read these verses, where the angel is announcing to Mary, the first person on earth who's physically being told and understanding that Jesus is going to be physically born, not sometime, not prophecy like in the Old Testament that one day a Savior would come, but that today is the day he's on his way. And now how many people can Mary tell? She probably could tell her family and she could tell her friends, but they won't totally understand even what this means, right? And they probably had a hard time believing or understanding, what do you mean you're going to have like the Son of God, and there's not going to be a human father, the Holy Spirit's going to be the father? My mom went to college in Milledgeville, Georgia, which had another famous institution. That's where people probably would have thought about sending Mary. It's like people probably didn't believe her, probably thought she was a little crazy. But Mary, before anyone else, would have known exactly what was happening. I mean, imagine carrying Jesus for these 9 months, to feel his first kick, and have him moving around in your womb. Things that I've never experienced and don't understand. But for Mary to be the first person on earth, to have an intimate connection with Christ in that way, and to experience him growing and then eventually having birth with him and raising him as a child, that God would choose her. Why? Not because she's special in any way. She's just a woman who has been found favored by God. She's not in Jerusalem, she's in Nazareth, right? She's not in the center of religious activity. She's not the daughter of the high priest or something. This is just a normal, everyday young woman in Nazareth who's been chosen because of her faithfulness. And God is showing her first and more intimately and in the quiet moments of the night in ways that other people just never experienced. That she got a chance to testify and witness just exactly what God was doing through the birth of Jesus. And as I said a few moments ago, I can only imagine the conversations that she and Elizabeth probably had as she went to visit. We know that right after this, she goes to visit Elizabeth. Elizabeth is about 6 months pregnant at that time with who we become to know as John the Baptist, and that when Mary speaks, that John the Baptist leaps in her womb. And so I can only imagine the conversations they have together as women who are friends and cousins as they go through these pregnancies together, and they have these incredible witnesses and testimonies that they kind of almost alone can truly understand. And I think that it's incredible that God chooses here Mary to be the very first person, and not just for a moment, but for a long time, to really come to know Christ as a human being. And as we begin to look at the life of Christ and as he goes on, we see and have talked about his discipleship process and how he had the 12 apostles that he called to carry around with him, but that there were more people traveling with him and learning with him. And we learned that many of them were women, rich and poor, healed and whole. All of these women traveling with Jesus and learning from him. And we learned last week that Jesus would go from town to town and he would heal people. And we saw encounters with women during those times. But we get to the end of Jesus' life. And I think we begin to find one of the most interesting moments of these women coming into contact with Christ in a way that other people don't necessarily have that same contact. And so I want you to think about the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus, and zoom ahead in his life to these moments when we see people coming to know him. And one thing I want you to know is that the women who witnessed his resurrection first witnessed his burial. Now this is important because it's important for the Gospels to establish for us that the people who saw him alive later also saw him dead before. They weren't mistaken. They weren't fooled. They hadn't heard a rumor that he had died, but really he was still alive. These women and these men all saw Jesus dead and buried before the resurrection. And so we see that in a couple of places. We can go to all four Gospels and see this, and we're going to jump around in the Gospels a little bit so that you get a little description from each one of them. And this is the way it looks in Mark chapter 15, verse 47. Mark describes who was there when Jesus was buried. He says, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, if you remember, when we say Mary, the mother of Joseph, we're talking about here a different Mary than Jesus' mom. This is not Jesus' mom, Mary. A few weeks ago, we mentioned that Mary was the most common name for young Jewish girls at that time. So it was like Mary, 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 Mary. There's 7 Marys down the street. Everybody's married, right? And so we have to kind of designate who we're talking about. And so Mary Magdalene, so this is Mary from Magdala. This is Mary, the mother of Joseph. They're there, and they see Jesus laid in the tomb. So they physically see him dead and sealed in the tomb. Matthew puts it this way. Matthew 27:61 says, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite of the tomb. They see where Jesus is laid. Luke 23:55 says it this way. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. So Joseph of Arimathea has asked for Jesus' body after the crucifixion. He's carrying it along with Nicodemus, this leader in the Pharisees, to be buried. And we have different accounts of different women who are following them to see him buried. Now, one of the things I want you to know is that just because the Gospels mention different people in different ways around the burial, and especially around the resurrection of Jesus, it doesn't actually mean that they're less reliable because they didn't get their stories straight. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Maybe it was Wednesday or Thursday, I don't remember what day it was. The girls and I were coming back from school, Ella and Faith. We pull up in the parking lot, and we see on the corner of the house, on the corner of the garage, kind of almost where you can't see it, one of those giant yellow Joro spiders. You know what I'm talking about? That are like the size of probably this big. It's probably like that. They're huge. These things are massive. And I hate spiders. I really don't like spiders. I'm sure they're plotting and planning. Behind all 8 eyes, they've got the plots going on. I just know it. Anytime I go to swat one or hit one or grab one, because the girls all scream and say, Dad, get the spider, I am sure that it is ready to jump so that as soon as I go to swat, it will leap onto my face. I know that's what's going to happen, right? And to have these giant spiders hanging around the house is not okay. I'm not okay with it. Now, here's the thing. We see this giant spider on the corner of the house, the 3 of us, and we look and we see there's another one down the side of the house we never go down, and there's another one on the other corner. We go down there, it's even bigger. And I am like, this cannot happen, right? This is not my house. I'm going to have to burn the house down in order to get away from all these spiders. We walk around the house. There's like 7 of them around the house in different places that have set up webs, and they're all just crazy big. But here's the good news. Halloween was Monday, and I was a construction worker for Halloween. And so I happened to have gotten out my old blowtorch from when I worked for an asphalt company. And so I had that thing out the other night, and I thought to myself, I am not going to like swat it with a broom where things are slinging and it could just come flying off and hit me. I'm going to get the blowtorch out, and I'm going to make sure these guys are done. And that is exactly what I did. Propane and a blowtorch. And of course the kids are like, aren't you going to burn the house down? And I'm like, shh. It's going to be fun, right? They're like, but they're right next to the house. And I'm like, it's a little flame. It's not very big. It's going to be fun, right? And sure enough, I walk around the house. Faith and I think, go out a little bit later. And we walk out to that first big one, and I burn that guy. Whoosh, he falls on the ground. Crispy. He's not coming back. I'm for sure, right? I'm for sure he's not coming back. By that time, Ella realized we were out there doing this, so she comes out and she sees us, And we go around the house, and one by one, what I found out that's really good is that the flame melts the web, so they fall on the ground, and they can't come at you. You know what I mean? Usually they swing around and stuff, or try to climb up. And so it falls on the ground, crispy. I get rid of all of these spiders. I am so pleased with myself. So I told Keisha about it. She comes home, and then she's like, oh, I wanted to see it. And then I realized, oh, good, well, that's okay. We went outside. There's one more left, right? We went out, and I did the last one for her, right? So she got to see the whole thing, too. The house has been purged. It is now clean and safe. And everyone can be comfortable now sleeping at night, knowing that those things are not watching us through the windows, right? Now, this is a true story that happened to me this week. But how can I tell that story? I can tell it like I just did. I can give you the details of who was there, when they were there, at what time we did things, and how there were different times, right? We saw the spiders first. We walked up to the spider, saw another spider. It was me, it was Ella, it was Faith. We walked around the house, we saw more spiders. We went inside, I got my tool, I went outside with Faith, we took care of the first one, then Ella came out, we took care of the rest, but I forgot one and missed one, but that's okay, because later Keisha came home and we took care of that one too. That's one way to tell the story. Another way to tell the story is, guys, you're not going to believe it. I came home from work the other day and I saw a giant spider on my house. Turns out there were like 7 of them all around. But don't worry, I took care of it. They're not a problem anymore. Now, is that the same story? Okay, what if I just said, now we came home the other day, my daughters and I, and we saw all these spiders around my house, and my kids and I, we burned them so they wouldn't bother us anymore. And they're gone now. Is that also the same story? Yes, it's the same story, right? So actually, the fact that we're getting variations in this story probably means, when more people tell it, that it's true. Because if it was untrue, and those people were telling the story, what do they have to do? They have to get their stories straight, don't they? They have to get together and say, first this happened, second this happened, third this happened. I was there, you were there, you weren't there, right? And you have to get that figured out. The fact that there's a little variation depending on which of the gospel writers is writing, which people they specifically talk to, and what's important to the readers that they're writing to, means that these stories are more likely to be true. So Mark, who's an action guy talking to the Gentiles, mentions things in a different way than Matthew, who's a Jewish guy talking to the Jews, that is different than John, who was one of the disciples who was actually not at the tomb first, but was one of the first people told himself, versus Luke, who's a historian who's been hired to get the story right. Each one of those gospel writers approaches the story not just from a different perspective, but uses different sources and people, and mentions different people at the tomb in order to verify the fact that it happened. It's not evidence that it's different stories told in different ways means they don't know what they're talking about. It's the same story told from different perspectives, which means they do actually know what they're talking about. And so I want you to look at this with me. We see the variations in the accounts of the resurrection, and which women were there. They actually add credibility to the accounts. John says it this way. Now remember, John is one of the disciples. He was at the cross. He was hiding with the disciples. He's one of the first people to hear about Jesus' resurrection. And so he's going to tell us who told him. And so what he says in John chapter 20, verse 1, he says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So why does John mention Mary Magdalene specifically? Probably because she was the one who came running back and told him personally that the tomb was empty. So he would mention her specifically. But here we go. Matthew sees it a different way. Matthew 28, 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. Well, which other Mary was it? It was this same Mary, mother of Joseph, that we saw in one of the other Gospels. This same Mary. And so he mirrors Mary Magdalene and the other Mary saw Jesus buried. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary saw the empty tomb. We go on to Mark chapter 16, verse 1. This is the way he conveys the story. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go and anoint Jesus' body. Now, we've seen 3 stories here. Mary Magdalene's gone to the tomb and saw the stone rolled. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of the other Mary, went to look at the tomb. And now we've seen it's not only Mary Magdalene, Mary, this mother of Joseph and James, but also Salome, who was one of the disciples we talked about of Jesus earlier, right? They not only went to look at the tomb or go to the tomb, but they went to anoint the body with spices. So we have different variations, not to disprove what's going on, but different writers bringing in different parts of the story at different times to demonstrate that these people all were there. Then Luke puts it this way. Luke, who's trying to get everything precise, says on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. And who were these women? Well, verse right before us, we read Luke 23:55 earlier. These are the women who came with Jesus from Galilee. So these were some of Jesus' followers and disciples. And so each of the Gospels is showing that different people arrived at the tomb first. But all of those people who arrived at the tomb first were women. Now, I mention this not to just say, girls, we rule the world. Girls, right? This is not just a Beyonce call out or something like that, okay? I mention that to say that if you are a gospel writer who wants to convince the world that you have reliable witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, then you want the disciples, the men, to be the ones, the first one at the tomb. Because in that culture and at that time, women are not considered very reliable witnesses. And if you don't have a man there to see it happen, then did it happen? It's like a bad joke about a tree in a forest or something like that, right? But culturally, that's the way it worked. And yet the gospel writers are determined to tell the truth of what happened and who was there first. And what I love about the way they tell this story, and we're going to see this here, if you want to turn to John chapter 20, we're going to see Mary Magdalene's experience that morning of going to the tomb and seeing Jesus. And this is what it says. In verse 17, Jesus said, this is after Mary's gotten there, she's seen the empty tomb, she's realized that this is Jesus who's resurrected physically right before her, and she's trying to hang on to him and hug him and say, oh, thank goodness that you're here. And Jesus says, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God. So Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. Imagine this experience. From the very beginning, Mary, the mother of Jesus, in Jesus' life, was the first to experience and understand that Jesus' life was starting. To his death, crucifixion, his burial, the women who were there to witness that, who knew for sure that he was dead and buried, were the first to see him alive and well in his resurrected body that next morning. Imagine the experience she has when she gets to run in and see the disciples and say, I have seen the Lord. They don't believe her at first, right? We know the story of Peter and John running to the tomb to see who could get there and see what was going on. We know that Jesus later appears over 40 days to more than 500 different people and shows himself. But it all starts here. Why does it matter that we have these witnesses and that these witnesses are women? What we learn from these witnesses is this. The closer we look at these accounts, the more we see that they are unexpected, that they're authentic, and that they're life-changing testimonies. This is what I mean by that. They're unexpected. Because God is continuing the story of using people that you wouldn't choose if you were picking your team. He starts way back with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, who's a murderer, who can't even speak clearly enough, is chosen to go before the king. You have Gideon, who is this pipsqueak from a pipsqueak's family, who's chosen to be a judge to deliver the people of God. He's the weakest of the weakest, and yet he's chosen to lead the army. You have King David himself, who becomes the greatest king of Israel in their time, and he is the little brother from a long line of big, handsome brothers. He's the little guy, the shepherd boy, who shouldn't really have even been chosen. Look at the disciples themselves, tax collectors and fishermen, people with rough language and rough lives. that Jesus collects and inspires and disciples again and again and again. God is choosing the least stuff in order to make the most of. And that's what he's done with these testimonies. In the unexpected way, he's chosen women first at a time when women would have been discounted to say, Jesus has come. He's the Son of God. He's lived a perfect life. He's died a physical death. And he's resurrected again physically in his body. We know these stories are authentic because if you wanted to tell it in a way that made people believe it, you would change the details from what they were saying. Again, you would get some reliable, good reputation guys at the tomb that morning so that people would say, well, I'm not going to challenge them. But instead, these are authentic testimonies from people who experienced what it was like to be in life with Christ. These are life-changing testimonies because if you're like me, then you've probably had those moments and may even this morning have that moment when you say, I'm the least of. I'm the one who God shouldn't choose. I'm the one who shouldn't be the one that God chooses as a witness and as a testimony to what he's done. I've messed up. I've fallen apart. I'm not always faithful. I've gotten it wrong so many times. I'm not smart enough, strong enough, talented enough, beautiful enough, articulate enough, intelligent enough. There are so many reasons I'm not enough. And yet we see again and again and again that in the most important moments, we are the kind of people that God chooses. We're the kind of people that God chooses to use in very big ways. And so this morning, man, woman, boy, girl, child, adult, wherever you are and wherever you feel like you've been, these testimonies of Mary, the humble young woman who experienced intimacy with the physical Jesus before anyone else could. Of these women who followed Christ in his life and learned from him and experienced healing from him, who saw him die on a cross and buried in a tomb. And then the next morning saw him alive again, the first ones there. Those experiences there are to tell us that God says, I take the least expected, least intended, least chosen people, and I make the most out of. There's a reason that in the Beatitudes it says that the poor in spirit are blessed. When we feel like we are the less than, our faith isn't strong enough, I'm not as strong of a Christian as this other person or that other person. When we feel that way, all we have to do is look at the very life of Jesus to see from the moment of conception to the moment of resurrection, he chooses the right people at the right time to show off himself. And they're not the big and strong and powerful. It's you and me. It's the humble. It's those that think we're not there yet. There's those that think my faith has so far to go before I'm where God wants me to be. It's us that God chooses. It's us that we can see reflected